Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The first face-to-face meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin will take place next month in Geneva. It's reported the leaders will discuss the full range of pressing issues, including fighting the pandemic as the two countries seek to restore predictability and stability to U.S. Russia relations. The high-stakes meeting comes nearly 3 years after President Putin met the U.S. President then, Donald Trump, in Helsinki. How different will this meeting be with the previous ones, and whether they're going to address some of the real pressing issues? How are their meetings likely to reflect about the latest geopolitical changes in the world? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on U.S. Russia ties, we are joined in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedashian, Professor of History at American University, and also Ambassador William Courtney, Adjunct Senior Fellow at the RAND Cooperation, who's former Special Assistant to U.S. President for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. So tell me more about why is this meeting, it seems all of a sudden, June the 16th. Ambassador Courtney.
There's quite a lot of interest in the United States in U.S.-Russian relations these days. Relations have become more tense, particularly with the Russian military buildup around Ukraine, now more recently the Belarus crisis. Mm-hmm. There's a feeling among a lot of people that having a high level of discussion is helpful to reduce the risk of miscommunication or misunderstanding, even if one doesn't expect a lot to come out of this. To make a comparison, in 1985, President Reagan and President Gorbachev met in Geneva, Switzerland. They didn't make much progress, but they developed a little mutual confidence, and they began to understand each other's positions better. I don't know that this summit meeting will be quite as positive as the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting, but it probably will help clear the air a bit.
I see. Professor Fedashian, we understand back in April, the Biden administration already trying to approach Moscow for a meeting. Of course, that's even at the same time when sanctions against the Russian officials are being planned, and also some kinds of not necessarily friendly ambience between the two countries were still in the cooking. So now, are things getting better? How do you see this June the 16th?
Well, I think it's too early to determine whether they are going to get better. The fact that there's going to be a meeting, I think, is a breakthrough, and it's long overdue. And that in itself is a very positive development, because despite the multiple disagreements on a whole range of issues that exist between Moscow and Washington, even during the Cold War, as Ambassador Courtney just mentioned, at the height of the Cold War in the middle of the 1980s, coming out of the Reagan, Andropov, and Chernenko years, Gorbachev and Reagan decided to meet and simply to start talking to each other. So this looks like a repetition of that kind of attempt. Listen, it's always better to talk and to keep in touch, especially with people you do not see eye to eye with. That is the whole purpose of diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't exist there to sort of to keep friends talking to each other. Diplomacy exists to take the edges off the rough corners, and sometimes to avoid full conflicts. And so in general, I'm very positive about the fact that the meeting will happen, but the details we'll just have to wait and see.
Right. It's interesting, at least to me, listening to both of you gentlemen, using analogy of the Cold War era, particularly almost at the end of the Cold War era, to describe what is going on and the logic between for the meetings between the two presidents, Russia and the United States. Why is that? To me, it's very interesting because the circumstances are very different now, I would say, Professor Fedashian.
Well, I think but part of it is the geography of things. Geneva, again, the middle of Europe, neutral space for the beginning of the rebuilding of the relationship. But I think there's also, of course, a sense of hope on both sides, by the way, that out of the darkness of the current misunderstanding, a light will eventually emerge. I just want to caution.
So you think this is a misunderstanding? There has been misunderstanding, right? That seems to be an interesting word.
No, I'd say this is a bit stronger than a misunderstanding. There are profound disagreements about some very basic things on both sides. And we can go down the list. Ukraine, the Middle East, there are many issues, election meddling and so on. So this is more than misunderstandings. The issue here is that the only way out of this is not posturing and not talking to each other and sanctioning each other. It really is talking to each other and working through the differences. And God knows, maybe this will be the beginning of another spiral out of the current standoff.
How much hope do you pin on that, Ambassador Courtney? And my earlier question as well, why is that analogy about almost the end of the Cold War, the last president of USSR's meeting with the former US president relevant here?
So the Cold War period that's most relevant right now is before Gorbachev came to power. It's the Brezhnev and Andropov-Chernenko period, when the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan, was secretly deploying SS-20 missiles against Europe and Japan, shot down the Korean Airlines passenger plane, was putting pressure on Poland to declare martial law to subdue the Solidarity Free Trade Union. Those are the kind of relations we have now. So this summit may be helpful to some extent in clearing the air, but unless some concrete problems can begin to be solved, there will not be political support to sustain a rich dialogue with Moscow. Thus far, Moscow and Washington have not really been able to solve any problems. Ukraine is being, as Professor Fedyasin pointed out, that's the first problem, that's the biggest problem. But now we have the election interference, cyber attacks, solar winds, the Russian support for what Lukashenko just did with the Ryanair flight. We don't see Moscow wanting to try to find solutions to any of these problems. And so this is why we have so much support in the US Congress for more sanctions on Russia.
On the other hand, Ambassador Courtney, you may have noticed that many of the allegations you just illustrated actually has been denied by the Russian side once they were raised by the US side. The issue is whether the US and Russia will be able to communicate on some of the accusations you just suggested. And the Russians have their list of accusations against the US as well. And meanwhile, whether the US will play a role toward the Europe, its earlier role of being the guardian, or a different role given the changes of the US role in the world today. Ambassador Courtney.
So you had asked about the role of Washington politics. The reason I'm bringing Europe into this is that this is not just a matter of Washington politics. This is a matter of politics throughout Europe and the United States. A lot of frustration with Russia's actions. In order to make progress, some of those problems have to begin to be solved.
Professor Fedyasin, as an observer of both sides, both Russia and the US, now you're based in the US, but you're originally coming from Russia. Tell me more about your sense of how the two countries are trying to carve themselves out about its own role now in a very dramatically changing world as we speak. What they are having on the agenda very much have to do with what their ambitions are and how they see each other and how they see themselves. So I know this is a very big topic, but I hope you will be able to shed some light as well on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Look, the Biden administration has made it clear that it sees itself as bringing America back into the global driver's seat. The question is whether there's only one driver's seat at this point in history or not. I've said this before on your show, and I'll repeat it again. We're all living through a very important stage in global history where the West, which has really determined the pulse and the tune of the planet's history for the past, give or take, 400 years, 500 ever since the Age of Discovery, is now facing non-Western powers that have the wherewithal, China first and foremost, of course, of them, that have the wherewithal to actually claim an important role, a co-leading role, let's put it that way, in articulating the rules of the game. So this is a massive historical change. It's a tectonic shift, and as with tectonic shifts, a lot of furniture gets moved and broken, and that's what we're seeing all over the place. The Biden administration seems to think that it can put the United States back in charge. And I'll be honest with you, for all of the nobility of the cause, I don't think that's going to be very easy to do. From the Russian side, there's a lot of talk about some kind of, global plan on Putin's part. I don't really see one. Russia is happy to be a continental power, regional power, keeping in mind that Eurasia is a pretty big continent. But the Russians aren't trying to export an ideology to the rest of the world the way that the Soviet Union certainly did, with some successes and some failures. So in that sense, the two countries are very different in the scale of the influence that they are looking for. But for the Russians, there is a perimeter around their border where they think they ought to have a voice in what happens, be it NATO expansion, be it geo-economic issues. And that was the source of the disagreement over Ukraine. And that's how I would answer your question.
Very interesting. Ambassador Courtney, you also want to shed some light on that?
So let me just make the point that while there are a lot of differences between Russia and the United States is not trying to keep Russia down. The United States would like for Russia to be a cooperative great power. A good example is in the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. Russia, China, several European countries, and the United States worked together to conclude that deal. That's how great powers can be most effective. Russia is a great power, but as Professor Fedyashin points out, it will only be a regional power if it tries to go it alone too much. Russia is overextended now, needs to try to find ways to cooperate more with other great powers to accomplish big purposes. One of those, of course, is climate change. Now, Russia is really feeling the effects of climate change, particularly up in the Arctic, which is warming faster than the rest of the Earth. So former Secretary of State John Kerry is eager to engage Russia in that. This would be one area for progress. But one way or another, if Russia is going to sustain itself as a great power, it needs to find a way to do that in a more cooperative manner.
Another question I really want to ask all of you, both of you, is the elephant in the room, right? The changes that you all beautifully illustrated. For example, China and the United States, or the role of China in the world, and the shifting geopolitics that's going on. How is, China, Russia, U.S.-China relations that is being the elephant in the room? How do you see the two sides, Washington and Moscow, likely to play that card toward one another? That is a fascinating question to me, at least in this part of the world. Professor Fedyashin.
I think the Russians are actually very conscious of what many scholars have called the strategic triangle of the United States, China, and Russia. The Russians are clearly willing to work with the Chinese right now, and there's a whole number of reasons for this, including geographical ones, their neighbors. And the Russians understand that they are in a very good position right now because they've essentially reversed what Kissinger and Nixon had done in the early 1970s. The triangle that makes up this strategic triad seems to have two sides more or less balancing against a third, that being the United States. And I think it's constantly in the back of Putin's mind that there is, beyond the specifics, there is the bigger overarching geostrategic equation, this triangle, and that the Russians are right now the balancers. And if they incline their weight towards the Chinese, that cup on the scale will win. If they incline their weight towards the Americans, then it will go the other way. Listen, there's a reason that it's been Kissinger who has been most outspokenly critical of American policy towards Russia, beginning with the Obama administration and through the Trump administration, because he's seeing the work that he had done in the 70s so painstakingly being unraveled. The U.S. has been pushing Russia into the hands of China from the American perspective.
Interesting. Ambassador Courtney, you experienced that in person, I guess, at that period of time. What do you make of now, that elephant in the room, the role of China and their relationship individually with China?
So there are some people in Washington who think that the U.S. should try to pull Russia away from China. And that's not realistic. Russia, because of its increased isolation from the West and from Europe, has moved toward China, and their closer relations will continue. Now, most of the Russian economy is in the western part of Russia, and the cultural ties are much stronger to Europe than to China. So when there's an opportunity, when Russia's misbehavior, if you will, diminishes and allows closer relations with Europe, we think we'll see Russia pull back toward Europe to a greater extent. But Russia and China are neighbors, so it's to be expected that they'll cooperate. If one makes a comparison, the Canadian economy relative to the U.S. economy is about the same proportion as the Russian economy to the Chinese economy. But the Canadians trade about 10 times more with the United States than Russia does with China. So there's a lot of potential for Russia and China to improve their economic cooperation, which it should. But most of the issues that the U.S. is dealing with regarding China are really unrelated to Russia. There are economic issues, there are issues about the Western Pacific. Russia is really in a different situation. So I think we'll see Russia and China continue to cooperate, but we should not expect that the balance of power is going to change in a dramatic way.
Professor Fedashin, respond.
Listen, I actually agree with what Ambassador Courtney says. I think he's right on the ball. I think the cooperation will continue, and the Russians are simply going to behave like all rational actors behave in a fast-changing system. They are going to pick the best partner for a given policy that they can. And that's pretty much been Putin's policy, especially the last 10 years. Putin's not an ideological thinker. He's very much a strategic and tactical thinker, and he chooses what he believes is best in Russia's interests.
Ambassador Courtney, further on that, we heard today that the U.S. State Department, some senior officials suggest that the age of engagement with China is over, quote, and it is the age of competition. Now, that is not news necessarily, but there seems to be ever more clearer statement coming out of Washington about its nature of relations with China. So if that is the case, the question really is not necessarily where Russia will go, but whether the U.S. could afford to have competitors / foes, rivals with both China and Russia, both at the same time. That is an interesting question. Ambassador Courtney.
So it's useful to remember that Xi Jinping has seen the relationship between China and the United States is pretty much different than the way Putin has seen the Russian relationship with the United States. China and the United States cooperate in so many areas in the economic domain, from iPhones being produced in China, many other things. Our ports in the west coast of the United States are receiving ships from China constantly. So the fundamental, if you will, basis for U.S.-Chinese relations has a strong commercial component, and that's likely to continue because both economies are dynamic. There are frictions, of course, in the East and South China Sea, some other, Taiwan recently has become a problem, and then with Xinjiang, Hong Kong, those are geopolitical issues as well. But the relationship between China and the United States is so much stronger than the relationship between the United States and Russia, because we have very little trade between the United States and Russia. We do have a common interest in our large nuclear arsenals and trying to maintain those and keep those safe and secure, if you will, reduce nuclear threats. But beyond that, the U.S. and Russia just don't have the mechanisms for cooperation that China and the U.S. have.
Now, looking forward to what might be on the agenda, what do you think could be the items that both sides, or Moscow and Washington, put on the final plan?
Jen, first of all, just record that we don't know yet exactly what's going to be on the discussion list. That hasn't been released. But I think that the following items will be. First of all, a very serious discussion of the future of Afghanistan, because now that the United States and NATO have failed to bring order and peace and stability and democracy to that country, the regional powers are going to have to step in. And the United States is going to have to ask itself some very serious questions about the extent to which it remains in Afghanistan, because the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians will then have to try to work with the Taliban. That's number one. Number two, the question of the Iran nuclear deal. Number three, the question of North Korea. Number four, the issue of Ukraine, which is going to be one of the more difficult issues, but not impossible issues to solve. Next, cybercrime, which is a huge question, and the Russians have repeatedly invited the United States to start talking about this seriously, and have so far been met with a refusal. We'll see if there are any changes, even behind closed doors. And last but not least, probably the environment. Although that is, in my opinion, it is existentially the most important, but also the most sort of vague issue.
Got it. Ambassador Courtney, your list.
So it's useful to separate some of the small issues from the grand issues. Both Russia and the United States are concerned that the size of their embassies now have been cut down. The personnel have been cut down to such low numbers that they can't do their normal business. And this has been as a result of various mutual reductions of personnel because of various differences. I think Russia and the United States will try to find a way to begin restoring more normal sizes of diplomatic representations. It would be useful, as Gorbachev and Reagan did in 1985, to find a way to increase people-to-people contacts, cultural exchanges, educational exchanges, things like that. Those also tend to be an enduring foundation for relations between countries and commercial relations. There are a lot of U.S. companies operating in Russia in non-sanctioned sectors, and they're doing quite well, doing good business. So we'd like to see if we can continue that, because again, commercial relations sometimes endure even as political relations go up and down. Then on the major issues, Ukraine will be by far number one, because the biggest sanctions that the West has on Russia related to the Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine, which still continues. As Professor Fedashin points out, the cyber attacks, election interference, that's clearly going to be a top issue. And then more recently, because of what's going on in Belarus, one imagines that that will become an issue as well. So there are quite a few issues to be discussed. And again, let me go back to the point that in order for relations to get better, some problems need to be solved. And it's not yet clear which ones of those might be.
All right. I want to thank both of you for giving us a lot of insights about the latest development and the future trends. Of course, U.S. and Russia finally be able to work on the nuclear threat, on the arsenals. Earlier, the extension of the agreement that was applauded by the rest of the world. But for the next stage, what's likely to happen, we'll have to wait and see. Thank you so much, Ambassador William Courtney, Professor Anton Fedashian. Really appreciate it. Thank you.